Each week, we're trying to give you just a short snippet of what journey groups are all about and how do we function in them and how do we experience God in the context of journey groups. So today, we're going to talk about hearing good news. And we talked about this last week already a little bit, but we want to focus in on how journey groups create a safe space to hear God speak and to respond in obedience. That's what we're hoping to experience in the context of journey groups. And for most of us, we have plenty of room for growth when it comes to hearing God speak consistently and clearly in our lives, let alone frequently and regularly, right? And there's some people, like I've talked to people who've been in the church most of their lives, and I'll say, do you hear God speak, or what's God saying to you? And they'll look at me like I got three heads. And they'll be like, I'm not sure if it's God or if it's me or if it's bad pizza. And there's not a lot of certainty that, yes, I have heard God speak, and then I can take a step of obedience in response to that. And so in the context of journey groups, we're all about hearing the voice of God speak directly into our lives, because if we can't hear God speak, how in the world are we supposed to know what we should do to take a next step of obedience, right? And so not only do we want to hear God speak, but we want to hear God speak good news from God to us, which is important. So we're not talking about hearing God speak generically, right? Because generic biblical truth does not lead to deep personal transformation. Generic biblical truth can be good to know and helpful. And some of us who've grown up in the church can spew lots of biblical knowledge. And Chris is reading through the Bible right now. He's in Leviticus. So if you want to know about Leviticus, he can tell you lots about the sacrificial system right now. But just knowing facts from the Bible generically won't change our lives deeply. And so in a journey group, our goal is to create this safe space to hear God speak good news that is from God and to us. All right? So in the journey group questions, kind of under that listening section, you've got three questions that are kind of helping us explore. What jumps out at us? What's it say about God? What's it say about us? And all of that is helping us to dig into the Scripture and get some generic good news, right? Kind of just a general picture of what's going on in this passage of Scripture. Questions 4 and 5 are these questions that are designed to help us strengthen our muscles for hearing good news from God to us. And so you might think about it this way. So question number 4 helps us move from generic to specific, all right? So the question is, well, where does the passage intersect with your life? What seems relevant to you? So we're going from God is loving to where's that connect with your life, right? From generic to specific. And that's good progress, but we press in with question number 5, which helps us go from specifics, kind of the specific realm of our life, to something that is personal, right? So we're going from specific to, this is not just good news about God, it's not just something that's relevant to your life, but this is a word that God is actually speaking to you, Lisa. Like God has a word of good news for you that's going to make a difference in your life. So let me model it with a passage of Scripture that God has spoken good news to me from repeatedly over the years, but this is a passage in Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Jesus extends this invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. And so you could pull a lot of good news about God, about humanity in that passage. We could learn about that. But when you get to question 4, here's how I've answered that question in a journey group context before. I said, I've been really frustrated and weary in parenting my kids. And It feels the opposite of easy and light. I'm sure nobody in the room with children can relate to my experience, but that's where it hit me one night as a journey group is discussing this passage. That's from generic to specific, right? So there's a context. But I still haven't heard good news from God to me yet, right? And so question 5 moves us into that space. And so as I tried to listen, as I kind of wrestled with that, the good news from God to me was something like this, and I tested it out in the journey group. I said, I think what God might be saying to me is something like, you don't have to be so frustrated and tired as a dad. There's a better way. Let me teach you a better way. Now that was not just specific, but it was a very personal word to me. And it resonated deep in my soul. And in fact, today, as I'm still wrestling with parenting 4 children, it speaks to me again today. How's that for irony that I plan to share that with you? And I needed that word again today. And it's good news, and that kind of good news that's from God to me, very personal, specific good news, I can act on that. And in that case, it has led repeatedly to specific action steps that bring about deep transformation in my life. Do you see the progression from general to specific to personal, where we're hearing God speak good news from God to us? All right, now let me run down really quick 4 kind of things to keep in mind as we are strengthening our muscles to hear good news from God. All right, I'm going to run through these really quickly, but maybe they're kind of summary and maybe a few new ideas here. So when you're listening for good news from God to you, listen for good news about maybe who God is. Not generically who God is, but like, I am your Father and I'll take care of you, right? Good news from God. So about who God is, or perhaps about what God has done, is doing, or will do. In my case, it was, let me teach you a better way, right? So that's a little bit about God, a little bit about me, but let me teach you a better way. Or also about who we are because of who God is and what God has done. Maybe you're somebody who's stressed out about not being good enough a lot, and maybe it would be good news sometimes when God speaks through Scripture and says, hey, you're my beloved daughter, even when you mess up, right? That would be good news about both God and but it's very personal and specific. Or listen for good news about how God is inviting us to trust Him in new ways. And so there's an invitation from God. When you're listening for good news, it will be a word of grace and vision, not judgment and condemnation. All right? Just helpful hints to keep in mind. God will never say, Chris, I've had enough of you. I'm done. Or why can't you get your act together, right? Not judgment and condemnation and shame, but grace and vision that invites us to move forward. Good news will sound like something Jesus will say. I shared this last week, but a lot of times question 5 I will rephrase like this. Hey, if Jesus sat down and pulled up a chair next to you, and He was going to say some good news to you, what do you think He would say? That question oftentimes sends light bulbs off in people's head and their imagination, because you can't imagine Jesus sitting there and saying something really mean and terrible to you. Some people can. That's a topic for another day, but it sounds like something Jesus would say. And then finally, good news will empower you to take a positive next step. So if you hear something that you think is good news, but it makes you feel guilty and frustrated and stuck and like, oh, I'll never be good enough, I'll never be able to do that, that's not really good news. Because God doesn't want to speak to you in a way that's going to load you with guilt and shame and keep you stuck where you are. He's going to give you an invitation or cast vision that's going to help you take a step forward. All right? So there's a few things that help us think, and just know this, hearing good news, like it takes some practice. That's the beauty of a journey group. It creates safe space for us to practice this way of living in relationship with God, where we are hearing good news from God to us, that we can take a next step growing in our journey with Jesus.